Now I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey. Dr. Bailey is a national expert on special education, transition, and MTSS and RTI. She is the principal consultant for the National Center on Intensive Intervention, the director of the Center of Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, and the director of the New Progress Center. Additionally, Dr. Bailey serves as the Project Quality Assurance Director for Wyoming's new Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Center. And we are blessed to have had her supporting the Wyoming Department of Education and our local educators for the past 8 years. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tessie Bailey. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And I am super excited to be here. And I know it's Thursday and it's late in the afternoon. So I'll try to keep it lively. We do have a smaller group today. So as Tom mentioned, if you want to engage in a more verbal back and forth conversation, just let us know and we can unmute your phone so you can ask some of those questions. I will say too that throughout the session, there will be some opportunities to take a look at some of the resources. So if you look in the chat box, what you'll see is there is a handout that's actually a resource for you to do this on your own. And what I'm going to talk about are some of the pitfalls that we often see in terms of this particular component of MTSS, as well as some ways in which we can avoid it. And so I just want to, I'm sure you all saw the Texas lawyer who had the CAT filter on. In case you're wondering, that CAT filter is really difficult to find, but there are a lot of other filters that are available in case you're trying to spice it up with your students. But in order for us to get started today, I just want to sense about where you're at, right? I mean, it's close to the end of the week. I know it's been cold and all sorts of things are happening in your site. So just take a moment in the chat box and give me the number of the picture that best represents how you're feeling at this particular moment. We got some 8s and some 3s. I see a 2 coming in and a 5, 3 and a 7. Yeah, so you can see, thanks, Bria, 5, and a couple of 5s. I like that. I like the 2. It's kind of like the fake smile that you're doing, like you're going to make it through today. But I definitely see a bunch of 8s in our group. And so I just say that because it kind of demonstrates, sort of the wide variety of readiness we come with to these sessions, as well as the energy level. And so I do understand that a lot of you are working full time and you have a lot of other things happening in your life. And so I'm kind of hoping that you can just take a break, sit back, relax, and sort of engage in the conversation, even if it's just by the chat box. I know you can't always see what people write, which allows you to sort of get a little more flexibility in what you write. You don't have to worry about what people say, and we will end up sharing that with the larger group. Although I'm going to point out Jennifer, who says she's definitely a 3, because she's tired of the ridiculous sub-zero temps and falling snow. I would take that here in Utah because we are super hot here and lots of avalanches and all our ice climbing areas are not forming. It's kind of sad, but I did see my home ski resort in Red Lodge, Montana, got to -42 below zero with wind chill, and they actually closed the resort because it was so cold. So Jennifer, I feel ya. So today's session, in the last session where we talked about the MTSS, we really talked about Tier 1 and it being the sort of foundation of what we do within MTSS. But I want to really talk about this idea that there are kids who, despite our high quality Tier 1, might need access to Tier 2 or supplemental intervention. It is one of those things that the research has evolved over time, but what's also really nice is that the research is much more robust here than it is in almost every other component of MTSS. I mean, you still have progress monitoring, but you will see it has a really direct connection to making sure we get the right kids within Tier 2. What we're going to be talking about today is how do we prevent this over-identification. I haven't really run into a lot of schools who are struggling with under-identification, but I do run into a lot of schools who are probably maxing out their capacity to provide supplemental supports, and as a result are lowering the overall quality and stressing us out as teachers. So we want to make sure that we have a good balance of a system that allows us to appropriately identify kids and be able to sustain and maintain those supports for kids as we move forward. So the outcomes of this session are really to focus on those validated practices for student risk identification. And I use that terminology because it kind of aligns with some of the other work that we're doing in our schools, right? Like risk identification actually was used commonly before MTSS. I think if you were in an early warning system at secondary, we often talked about risk in some way, but we haven't always formalized our definition of risk. Or even if there was a definition, it was so vague that we didn't really know how to apply it at the setting in which we were at. And so I have this resource here that's the Tier 2 identification procedures, and I'm going to kind of walk along my presentation with that resource, but it's also a way to take what you're hearing today and apply it to your local setting, right? I can only do so much in terms of increasing your overall knowledge, but it's going to require a teaming approach to say, wow, do we really have an appropriate capacity for Tier 2? Are we serving 50 kids, but we really only have capacity for 20? Or are we over-identifying kids because we don't really know how to identify that risk status? So that's what this tool will help you do, and I'm going to walk you through that, which then allows you to meet the second outcome. And as we're walking through this process, I encourage you to think about your own written procedures. We do know the same with interventions and your core curriculum that we're looking for and elements of fidelity of implementation. The same thing occurs in our procedures, right? That if we say that we're going to identify kids in this way, that we have a level of fidelity to that process. And that way, if we feel like we're getting the wrong kids or too many kids, then we can systematically look at our process and say, when it's implemented this way, these are the results we get. How should we change that, right? That same intensification or adaptation that we do for kids with intervention, we want to do the exact same thing with our procedures within MTSS. So there are some actual templates and activities that exist within the handout. So I'm going to show you how to do some of those, but because this is a virtual setting and you're probably the only person from your team in some cases, I want to make sure that you have the things that you can go back to your team and say, how many kids can we feasibly serve with a high level of fidelity? So you'll find those practical things in there, as well as the directions to help you sort of think about where do you move next. Now, you probably already have a lot going on in your site. And so just to give me a sense about where you are, is think about this continuum. And, you know, and it's this knowledge of Tier 2 identification. Do you just know that it happens, but you can't really articulate what you're doing or why you're doing it that way? You're just doing what somebody told you to do. That'd be more in the beginning. Or do you feel like you're more in this mature level where you have some very clearly written procedures and you all are monitoring the fidelity to those procedures and getting the results that you're getting? So I see some 3s in the chat box, some 1s, which is good for me, right? So at least something today will maybe increase your knowledge about that. Anyone feeling like really strong in this area? Lots of 3s. I think that's kind of where we sometimes think we've gotten some of the procedures in place, we've kind of written them out, we've talked about them, but we maybe haven't standardized them or made them systematic across our different schools or even across our teachers within the same school. So before we get into some of the pitfalls that we often see that really highlight the importance of Tier 2 identification approaches, I just wanted to share some big bucket things. When we think about tier 2 identification, the assumption that we're looking at is it's following some sort of standardized school-wide approach to screening, right? And that you've clarified what you're screening for, whether it's behavior, or academics, or early warning indicators, and that the way that you're using that screening tool is valid and reliable, right? That you have something in place. Now, some of you may feel like, oh my heck, we don't even have the screener in place. So we can talk about that because there are a lot of resources to help you do that. Some of them are free, but that really is this sort of underlying component that, like we talked about in tier 1, is you have a way to identify who may or may not be responding to your core programming that's being provided to all students. The other thing is that we know that just because you're identified as at risk, it doesn't mean you need an intervention or that the school has the capacity or the obligation to provide an intervention. And that might seem kind of tricky, but you can think about COVID as an example. Let's say you have 100 kids in your school, and prior to COVID, 80% of your kids were at or above target. They missed spring instruction. Summer was a hot mess. They came back to virtual learning. We had intermittent participation, and then our screening came around in January. And now 80% of our kids are showing up as at risk. So it doesn't mean that we're going to do intervention for 80% of those kids. That's just not feasible. And so there's this difference between risk identification and tier 2 identification. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. The thing about that difference between risk identification and tier 2 identification goes along with this last bullet, that the percentage of kids that we identify for tier 2 supports really depends upon our tier 2 system capacity. And this has been a difficult concept to grasp for some people. And in fact, people sometimes get upset to say, when I say it's not feasible to deliver intervention for half of your population. And people come back and say, but I can, and we're doing it. And this is all the stuff we have going on, and the interventions are running. And I'm not saying that you can't do it. I'm just saying it's not feasible. And the evidence is pretty compelling that it's also not very effective. Because if the majority of kids are in intervention, it means they're missing something, which is often that access to core programming in which the intervention is built on. So in a sense, you're digging a hole while somebody else is filling it in, and you don't really see any measurable progress for students. So we're going to talk about that distinction between, those identified as at risk and what does our system really have the capacity to support in order to get results. We don't want to just do it to say we're doing it. We want to do it to demonstrate results. So there are 3 major pitfalls that we have highlighted over the last decade, probably over the last 15 years or so, and that really come down to this tier 2 identification and clarity around tier 2. They're major threats to MTSS. And if we don't address them or prevent them, then we might be doing things that look like MTSS, but we're either misallocating our resources, we're overworking, we're doing stuff, but it's not really producing effects. And that's important because we can say that we have tier 2, we can say that we're doing MTSS, but if we're over-identifying kids or under-identifying kids, then we're not benefiting the right kids. And so that's kind of where the title comes from, is we want the right kids getting the right supports at the right time. Now, this issue of over and under identification is pretty significant, particularly under COVID and as our resources become less available to us and our money's coming, we have to really be cautious. I think when we have lots of money or people are throwing all sorts of interventions at us, we often don't really sit down and say, is this what we need? We just think, man, we must have everything that we need. And so we're going to talk about the effects of over-identification and under-identification. So if you take into account like public health, and COVID is such a good example for all sorts of stuff, is that if we over-identify, right, we have this expensive testing, people are worried, it creates a level of a stress that prevents us from being as productive and as successful as we can be. I think from a systems level, it also stretches our overall resources, right? Because if we're over-identifying, that means those who could be treating people who are sick are spending more of their time assessing to see who's likely to be sick, or are providing supports to those who don't really need it, right? And so what happens is those who really need it often get a watered down, and those who don't need it are getting stuff that they don't really need, right? And it's kind of wasting their time. We also have this concern about under-identification, and it's not very common in our field, but there are some subgroups of students who tend to be under-identified for intervention for various reasons, whether it's our misunderstanding about what they're doing, and girls tend to be less identified than boys, particularly in behavior. So it's that sort of, over-identification seems like the bigger issue, but under-identification could also occur. So we can apply that same thinking to education, and this over-identification issue can be extremely expensive, but I think more than anything is that it can be very taxing on our limited resources. And anything that we're doing that is not core programming is pulling resources and supports and focus from the core program, thus overall sort of limiting the effects that we're going to get. So we want to be very cautious about who actually gets the intervention and who doesn't, right? We don't just want to haphazardly make that decision. The same thing with under-identification is there are ways for us to manipulate our data so that we don't, that we over-identify, and then sometimes we don't get kids who should have been identified early enough, and it actually makes it harder for us to intervene. So I just want to share these three major pitfalls, and then just get your thoughts about what you're seeing in your school. What's the pitfall that is maybe your major issue? And feel free to share that at any time, but just know at the end of this, I'm going to ask you. So the biggest thing that we see, and I addressed this in the last session, is about poor quality tier 1, meaning tier 2 is becoming the Band-Aid or the response to the effects of a poor quality tier 1. That can lead to significant strain on our tier 2, which is not sustainable. But I think more importantly, as I mentioned in the first session around tier 1, is it ultimately lowers the overall quality of education for those kids in tier 1, so we're not addressing it, but those kids who enter into tier 2, right? Because we're just replacing tier 1 skills without really having the opportunity to intervene. The other thing, and we'll focus a lot on this one today, is that we tend to flood our tier 2 with false positives. We're a very emotional field, and sometimes we believe the kids should be there, or we often defer to hard data because we don't want to put our emotions in it. And as a result, we have kids who don't need intervention getting intervention. They're taking a precious spot away from somebody. And then finally, we'll talk about this in our next session around tier 3, is that we are not very specific around the distinction between who needs tier 2 and who really needs intensive intervention at tier 3. So as a result, all kids tend to get lumped into tier 3 because we don't have very systematic processes about when do we push that kid up to more intensive supports, or on the other side, when do we push them down to less intensive supports. So I think from an educator standpoint, I mean, it does create inefficiencies in our system, but I think more, the bigger issue is it increases the stress that we have as teachers because we're trying to work around these inefficiencies, which then ultimately decrease the quality of our services. So today, the mantra will be the simpler, the better. right? As clear cut, black or white as we can get it. There will always be a little room for error, but that's the whole point of MTSS is progress monitoring and screening help us make sure no kids fall through the cracks. So just a little bit more about this poor quality tier 1. It is probably the most costly error that we have because most of our funds and resources are put into developing a tier 1 system. And if we don't put in a high quality tier 1 system, it's almost like we're paying something else to sort of supplement the inadequacies of that, as opposed to reinvesting or improving the quality of the tier 1. And so I do recommend, and maybe we can put the link in the chat box, is if you haven't seen the tier 1 webinar, to definitely check it out because it gets into some of those things that increase the overall quality of tier 1 to prevent this over-identification. Now, there are some indicators, right? And I think the indicator that we have this pitfall affecting our school is when we see less than about 75 to 80% of our students benefiting from core programming alone. And that's where our screening tools, which we assume are valid and reliable, are saying, you know, more than 20% of kids aren't benefiting. That means we're doing something, but it's not having an effect. So then the question is, why are we doing it that way if we're not getting the effects? If you find that this is an issue, some quick strategies, and Supriya is going to put some links in the chat box, are to, you know, I check out that webinar, but there are, as your kids are coming in back from a virtual learning to face-to-face, we can increase it through things like PALS or peer-assisted learning strategies, and those are effective in both literacy and math and writing. The high leverage practices are increasing the intensity of the way that we deliver instruction. It's getting us to be more intentional and focused in our quality. Ensuring that we're really thinking about differentiation. I think that's the challenge we're going to have as we move through this school year into the next one is COVID disproportionately affects kids, right? And so those who have lack of access probably have more loss of learning than those who have a parent at home who didn't work, who could provide one-on-one support for their kid, right? There's a huge discrepancy. And so we have to be thinking about how do we differentiate our supports. Supriya also put in the IES practice guides, and that's a good reflection for us to say, you know, we have limited time. We have kids with this broad array of skill deficits and skill knowledge. How do we know that we're focusing on the right skills and knowledge? And so the IES practice guides can help you do that. They're for K-12, all disability, not disability categories, student types, English language learners, students with disabilities, struggling students, as well as grade students. So another thing that we see, I think the second pitfall, and I'm curious if you feel like you have the first pitfall as your major pitfall or this second pitfall. And this is where we feel like we're providing interventions that kids may not really need it, right? If we'd have just beefed up what was happening in tier 1, the kid would have been just fine. But instead of doing that, we're now pulling the kid out of what was tier 1 to provide the supplemental support. And the kid's kind of like, eh. We see this a lot, particularly at the secondary level, where kids are starting to feel disengaged. They messed around on the screening tool. They didn't really get an accurate measure. And we, in a sense, say, well, any kid who didn't do well goes into intervention. So kids who don't need it are sitting in it because of their poor behavioral performance, not necessarily the poor academic performance. So I will just say, and I'm going to show you some evidence of this in a little bit, is most of your universal screening tools are designed in the way that their psychometric properties are set up is to identify a greater number of false positives, right? So they're intentionally identifying kids who don't need assistance, so that we don't miss anyone, right? And as a result, if we just depend on our tier 2 system or our screening system to identify who goes into tier 2, then we say things like all the yellow kids are going into intervention, and that's not the best way to do that. Or all red kids need intensive intervention, not really an accurate way to identify kids. It seems easy, but it's going to have a lot of error in it. So a pitfall that you might see is that you have more than 20% of your kids sitting in a tier 2 intervention at this moment. Even if you had 80% of kids identified as intervention, realistically, given the way we're funded, the way we're staffed, the intensity of the way interventions are set up, we feasibly cannot support more than 20% in this supplemental support. So this last one, which we will talk a lot more about in the next tier 3 session, is that we start to see some differences in our tier 2, tier 3. And so one of the things that we look at is trying to prevent the over-identification of kids coming from tier 1 to tier 2 and try to identify those kids who really need intensive supports much earlier on in the system. So this over-identification can dilute the overall effectiveness. As I mentioned, we see a really big impact at the secondary level because kids are in there based on disengagement as opposed to actual need. And so a way to prevent this particular pitfall is, and I'll share how you can do this, the handout outlines it, is that you need at least 2 other data sources to verify that decision. The more systematic you can be, the quicker it's going to be. If we have to problem solve around every kid, we just aren't going to have the time to devote to the actual instruction because we spend all our time trying to figure out who it is. So you have your standard, your initial risk identifier, then you have a valid secondary one, and you only verify risk for those who are identified as at risk, and then you use a third screener for those who have discrepancies, right? If I have 2 tools that say you're at risk, I don't really need a third one to confirm it. I might use the third one as a diagnostic tool, but I've got confirmation that you're really at risk. And from a savings, so there might be some administrators out there who are like, well, what does this really look like? So the Fuchs out of Vanderbilt have really been looking at the cost savings of making sure that we prevent this particular pitfall. The first pitfall, very costly as well, but this one we can put an actual number to. And that's because if you think about, we identified 72 kids in our school as at risk, right? We did our screener, they were all yellow and red. If we use a secondary screener, what we will find is that we rule out our secondary screening process that a proportion of those students don't need intervention. They might just need supplemental supports in the core programming, or it was a false positive, right? They're messing around on the test, they were sick or something, so it just wasn't a good indicator. So you'll see in this example, that additional data decreased the number of false positives to 29, right? So those are the kids that we confirmed based on our data as being at risk. So we know there's a cost to this secondary screener. And I think sometimes that's what prevents people from doing it. But what I will say is you don't have to have another data system, right? Like if you're paying for Ames Web, you don't need to buy FastBridge to confirm Ames Web. Instead, you would take your validated screener that you have in place, and then you use supplemental data that's generally valid. Classroom assessments, maybe you do a diagnostic assessment. Maybe in the secondary level, you do an interview with kids. So it doesn't have to be a purchase assessment, but it just has to be a good indicator of the concern that's being identified on the initial screener. So if we assume that the cost to do that secondary screener to rule out those kids who are false positives costs us about $5,500, then what we start to look at is that's a savings, because if we hadn't ruled out those false positives, we would have been providing intervention for 72 kids as opposed to just the 29. And that we can put a number on. We can say that if we had this many small groups with this many staff using this amount of time, there is a dollar amount associated with providing that intervention. And yes, there's some cost to the secondary screener, but it's a net gain for us. And then that allows us to reallocate that saved money to improving the overall core programming. Hopefully that made sense, but I think it's just something that, we often don't think about it. We think about it more from oh, the kid needs help or whatnot, and we're going to provide it, versus could we actually help the kid better by making sure they're more appropriately placed in an intervention or a core program. The last pitfall, which I jumped the gun a little bit earlier, is just failing to meaningfully distinguish between the intensity of tier 2, tier 3. Sometimes we provide too much intensity at tier 2, which strains our resources as well. And instead, we want to focus on getting a validated intervention platform that works for most kids, right? That as delivered with fidelity, it's going to give us our biggest bang for our buck. And really limit what we see for tier 3, which we'll talk about next time, for those who have the most intensive support. If most kids are fast tracking through your tier 2 to tier 3, your tier 2 system is inappropriate, right? So even if you identified the right kids, they're getting the wrong services. So, and a sort of indicator is that 7% of your kids or more are getting tier 3. And that's where we need to step back and say, how can we improve our tier 2 to get that? So some solutions I would say is really focus on intensive intervention for those not responding. That means once we've confirmed risk status and need for tier 2, that the intervention is appropriate, it is benefiting most kids, and only those kids not responding would maybe move into a tier 3 that's there. So I know that's a lot, so I just want to stop right there. And I love the game Pitfall. I was a big Atari Pitfall fan, like back in the day. So what do you see is your biggest pitfall? Is it that tier 1 issue? Is it the over-identification that you're seeing at tier 2? Or is it really this mismatch or lack of clarity between your tier 2 and your tier 3? If you can just take a moment and put that in the chat box. Michelle's saying that 1 and 2, yeah, the most costly, I think. So Tom, I am going to put you on the spot as well, and because I know you've been in a lot of schools, and I'm curious about what you're seeing. A lot of our participants are saying that tier 1 or that pitfall 1 and pitfall 2. Are you seeing some of the same challenges in schools?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. And a lot of the schools we've worked with, we see a over-identification, and it really comes down to, I think, sometimes how they're being identified. And you've pretty much already covered this as well, dealing with, not all 80% of your students need to have it, so really having a set of decision rules. And I think that's what's lacking in a lot of places is producing that cutoff for students, or at least the number of students that actually need it versus those that just could be remediated with high leverage practices in tier 1.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think the way we can avoid some of these pitfalls is just like what Tom said, is what is it that we can do in tier 1 that's going to meet the needs of most of those kids who maybe were identified as at risk, particularly with large amounts of them. And so something I would recommend is if more than 20% of your kids show up as at risk or, as maybe, needing intervention, we've got to do a root cause analysis with our tier 1 and saying, where are we missing the boat? Right? Is it a high leverage practice issue like Tom mentioned, or is it a attendance issue? Maybe it's a curriculum issue or a behavioral issue. I mean, it could be anything, but that's where if we address that, we meet the needs of a greater number of students. Something else you said, Tom, that I think is really a great strategy is identifying and utilizing validated approaches for this. I think we aren't as intentional sometimes with tier 2. We just sort of default to a system to tell us who's going to be there, as opposed to working as a team and implementing a validated process for that. All right, so what I want to encourage you to do is and we'll put the link back in the chat box, if you don't have the handout available to you, please try to get access to it, because I'm going to give you some opportunity to read through it, check it out, and look at how this can help you refine your current system. And I will say the first step is really twofold. It's assessing your system capacity, but within that system capacity, it's also assessing your intervention capacity. I often see people misusing interventions. It was designed for 4 kids. There are 7 in the group. It was designed for a class size of 10, but I have 21 and I'm trying to make it work. That's where we are doing something, but we're overloading our capacity, which leads to an ultimately decline in the quality of that intervention. So what do we need to understand about Tier 2 system capacity? It is that if your system is overwhelmed, just like if you as a teacher are overwhelmed, we're likely to have limited or poor learning outcomes, right? It's where we're meeting a procedural requirement to put kids in intervention, but there's no effect. And that to me is, it's not respectful of teachers' time, and it's not respectful of students' time. So if we're going to put them in an intervention, we have to be able to set the environment up for the intervention to be successful, which means we have to adhere to the grouping sizes. We have to adhere to the training requirements for the teacher, the dosage, how often the intervention is being delivered. Otherwise, there's no effect. We see this a lot at the secondary level too, with the scheduling, the way it's set up, where people will say, I can only do intervention twice a week. Well, if you think about you doing, like you're in a weight loss program, if you're only sort of doing something twice a week, you're not going to get the same results as if you do it daily for a specific period of time. So learning is just like that, particularly when we have kids who are really at risk. We need the intensity in a very short period of time so that we can close the gap, right? Teaching math facts over a year is not as effective as teaching math facts and intensive intervention over 2 to 3 weeks. Okay. So a way to think about this, and you'll see this graphic actually in the handout that you have, is that we have to be able to think about our Tier 2 capacity. We have to be honest about our current reality. There are things we want to do, but there are things that we realistically can do based on our resources, staffing, the context that's happening. So that idea of an 80-15-5 has really come from first the medical field and the behavioral field that looked at system sustainability. Right? When we talk about like hospitals are going to get overwhelmed, there's a tipping point. And that tipping point is usually around 60%, where that most of the resources start to divert to crisis and we can't sustain. And so we try to set our systems up where the 80% of our population is being met by high quality core programming alone. So if that is happening, then it allows us to take a step back with a core set of staff and devote more intensive supports to Tier 2 and Tier 3, right? So we have to have somebody still running the bigger ship while we're working on a certain floor or a certain classroom. Now, in some schools, they have less resources, right? The capacity of their staff is less. Their scheduling is a little bit different. And so they may actually have a different capacity where they need to ensure that their overall core curriculum meets a greater number of students because they really only have the resources to support about 15% of kids, where another maybe wealthier school with more resources and service providers can meet the needs of 20% of kids, right? So it's really being honest about our current capacity. The first place to start, and you'll see this in the handout, is that we look at our actual intervention capacity, not just of the people, right, but the intervention capacity, the things that we are using to actually provide Tier 2. So I'll just give you this example, and this is also in your handout, is I'm going to use fraction face-off. It's a standardized evidence-based intervention The implementation requirements make it very clear that it's grouping sizes of 2 to 3 to get the effects, right, that we see in the literature. And we have to do it 30 minutes, 3 times a week for 12 weeks. And then we look at what staff do we have, right, that have the skills as well as the schedule to actually deliver that intervention, right? So it's the match between those two. And then we have to look at when is it actually able to be delivered in our current schedule. So while we might say, oh my gosh, I'd love to run 6 groups, realistically, I only have 2 staff with slots at these times. So if I look at the capacity of that intervention, I really can only help 12 kids every 12 weeks, right? That's a very concrete number. It helps us be more honest in what our overall system can provide. So if we have multiple interventions occurring in our school, we actually have to look at each of those, right? Because it's not just this intervention and move on. My system probably has math interventions, other reading interventions that are also pulling on staff and resources concurrently. And so while we have the materials to run it, we may not have the staff. Or maybe we have the staff, but our schedule is not really conducive to what's necessary. So hopefully that's really looking at the individual intervention capacity. And then once you do that, you can then step back and say, wow, if we add up all the capacity that we have, this is the number of kids that we can support K-6 or 6 through 8. And for example, in this school, they found with their current interventions, schedule, staffing, they can really only provide intervention to 42 kids with a high level of fidelity, right? And maybe 80 kids are identified. So what it shows is that while we have a greater need, we only have capacity. And the question we then ask ourselves is, well, do we just take all those kids? Because I don't want to leave them, like we feel that emotion. But if we take them, we ultimately lower the quality for every kid. And it would be better to prioritize, right, based on your screening identification procedures, those 42 kids. It's 12 weeks, right? And then you can start the next cycle. And that would lead to greater effects than trying to do it all at once. So just some considerations as you're thinking about your capacity, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of time to just reflect and look at the resource and debrief. And then I'd love to get some of your feedback or questions about it. But remember that some grades are going to need more supports than others. In an effective MTSS system, the majority of your intervention resources should be devoted to K-1-2. And that's because the evidence is really compelling that that's where we have the greatest opportunity to prevent learning loss and get kids back on track. As kids get older, the intensity and the resources and staff needed to intervene is much greater, right? So while we can have greater capacity at K-1-2, because we can have like groups of 6 or whatever, as kids get into that 6th, 7th, and upper grades, the need to individualize and provide more supports becomes more costly, which then reduces the number of kids our capacity can actually handle. The other thing too, I always get people to think about is sustainability. Like right now, maybe I'm highly motivated, we're all jumping on board to respond to COVID, but there's no way that we can emotionally and physically sustain this level of intensity. And I think this is kind of what happens a lot in an early implementation of MTSS is we're all in because we've noticed there's a discrepancy. And we've got to get people back on track to stabilize our system so that it's sustainable. We also want to make sure if we're doing that system capacity, if you look at your interventions, are you really even addressing all areas of need? Or is the only thing you're looking at is, well, if you have a reading deficit, we can provide intervention, but if it's math, hopefully you can get that later, right? So we have to look at the capacity of our tier 2 system, not just in a single domain, but across domains, which then ultimately reduces our literacy capacity and math capacity. And then I think the critical question that, I can't answer for you because I don't know your system, your resources, and your needs is, what do we do if more kids are needing intervention? Like, you've confirmed that they need intervention, but you just don't have the capacity. And that's where a lot of schools are right now. And they're making very hard decisions. As I mentioned, you're going to have a greater effect if you can really be intentional about fidelity to the intervention for a small group while providing robust tier 1 supplements than to try to address the needs of all those kids simultaneously. It just is not going to, you're going to be at this chronically failing school because somebody's digging the hole while somebody else is filling it in. So I want to stop right there and just give you a moment to take a look at the resource. And what we've talked about right here is just the step 1 and step 2. And I want to give you just a couple of minutes to take a look at that. And if you have to run to the bathroom, you can do that as well. But I'm curious, to what extent have you really assessed your tier 2 capacity? I mean, can you really articulate how many kids it can feasibly support with a high level of fidelity? And if you've done that, I'd be curious about what percentages you're finding. And if you haven't done that, what do you think would be a good next step for you? So it's 3:50. So I want to give you about 5 minutes to do this and take a look at it. Think about your own system. And then what I'd like you to do is share some of your thinking in the chat box to make it a little more engaging conversation as we come back about this concept of tier 2 capacity. So I just want to ask Tom or Jennifer or Dina if any sort of questions, comments, or ahas that you want to share with the group before they go to their little review time, reflection time.
I have nothing, Tess.
Good. All right. Well, I'm going to give you 5 minutes. And then what I'm going to ask is, thanks, Jennifer, but just let us know, what is something you're thinking about in terms of your tier 2 capacity. So 5 minutes and we'll be right back. So as you saw in the chat, you have about 2 more minutes, and just feel free to share some of your thoughts. And if you are feeling brave, we'd love to unmute you and have you share out where you are and what you're thinking about next steps. So we'll come back in about 30 seconds. All right, do I have any brave souls, depending, it doesn't really matter where you are in your education system, who have any reflections or thoughts about this this idea of our tier 2 capacity. I think if you want to unmute, you can just let Tom know. If you just want to type it in the chat box because you don't want anyone to know who you are, feel free to do that as well. It's all my number 8s, my cat scale number 8s.
Tessie, I'll just throw out there just a quick comment, not really much of that, but just coming from a district point of view, I will say that sadly, you know, what I saw a lot of was you have tier 1 and then you have tier 3. There really wasn't a whole lot of middle tier 2 that was going on. And so I think that's, you know, this is definitely a great thing that we need to take a look at and see and make sure that we are assessing this as a state.
Yeah. I think too, I mean, something to consider is people are like, I don't even know which interventions we have. And maybe you have no interventions, you have no idea. The reason I combine these two right here is because you may actually say, you know what, maybe if we want to just start this way and say, we work backwards, right? I want to be able to support 20% of kids because that seems to be conventional wisdom about what we can feasibly support. What is our total number of students in the target grade or target school? And then get a number so that when you're looking at those kids who have been identified as at risk, then you can say, wow, we only have capacity for 42, but 80 kids need supports. How can we prioritize or triage and meet these needs? So, so I'm just reading a comment and often, so, and I'm going to try to read it and summarize it simultaneously, which is often a little tricky. It's I'm saying, you know, I'm not really in the position to speak to our current system or its capacity. And I think what's interesting is you're saying, you know, you're in special education and that system capacity is outside. And that's sometimes an issue because kids with disabilities, even if they're eligible under IDEA, would still benefit from those tier 2 supports. And I think what sometimes happens is though the school may make a decision, well, they're in special ed, so we're gonna prioritize these slots for these other kids. But you were saying, I find myself often puzzling about tier 2 when I engage in conversations with other professionals and hoping, you know, listening to today can help you better understand. So hopefully this is answering some of those questions. Yeah, and Tracy is saying that different trainers refer to tier 3 as verified students, and some say tier 3 is Title I with verified tiers. And how is this defined? So I will speak from the national level, and as I speak from that level, we do know that states and districts can then take their and do it however they want. From the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which is the second and third iteration of the National RTI Center or MTSS Center, students with disabilities were primarily served across the tiers. And OSEP has even made it clear that sustained intensive intervention, right, where we're doing this iterative cycle is not really feasible with kids with disabilities in special ed. We're not really funded that way. So a lot of the services that we sometimes do in special ed look like a group, right? We have groups of 3 or 4 kids who are working with a paraeducator. Those are similar to a tier 2 level of support, even if they're being provided through special education funding. It's not so much who's providing it or where it's being provided. It comes down to the intensity of supports. Now, most kids with disabilities, or most of the students who feed your tier 3, who have the most intensive supports and need intensive intervention, are those kids with disabilities. But we often find that kids who have not yet been identified may also need intensive supports. But you'll find from researchers that if kids need ongoing intensive supports at tier 3, that may be a trigger that is a child who needs specially designed instruction, right? Because tier 3 is this more individualized, specially designed, and a referral may be warranted. So, but yeah, and I will say in the early work, and Tracy, you mentioned about the Title I, OSEP and the U.S. Department of Ed used to say Title I was tier 2 and that special ed was tier 3. There was some early work. They have since pulled all of that guidance back. I think it was from around like 2010, and said it's really not like a funding label that puts you in a tier as much as it is the needs of that student, right? So you could be a title student who needs intensive support. Title funds might provide part of it, but some of your general funds may also provide some of that intensification. So hopefully that makes sense. And I think you can give me a thumbs up or a OMG or and just let us know. Okay, good. Yeah, so I think there's two ways, just depending where you are, but I do recommend really trying to get a handle on your capacity. And if, like you said, Ellen, you're not part of that conversation, then this might be something pass on to see what is available, because you want kids with disabilities to also be able to access supplemental supports, right? Maybe they're only identified in reading, but they need supplemental supports in math. You don't want your system to say, well, because they're getting special ed in reading, they don't qualify for our tier 2 or tier 3 supports in math. So I think that the rest of this session will really be then looking at, once we understand our capacity, it really helps us be more thoughtful about the identification and the risk verification. And Tom sort of shared some of this as well, but this is what we find from the literature and around determining risk status. And this has actually not changed for the last 15 years. It came from guidance from the US Department of Ed. It came through the RTI Center and has consistently remained in there. That when we think about identifying kids at risk, we have to have written decision rules. Otherwise, we risk inequitable implementation of risk identification, right? Because we then depend on somebody's perception or who's at the meeting to make that risk identification, which could unintentionally misidentify a kid or prevent identification. So the other thing too is we want to make sure not that we just have them in written procedures, but that the staff can clearly articulate what those risk status is, right? So that you don't get this backlash like, what are you talking about? I referred the kid, he should be in tier 2. That people understand there is a systematic procedures for that tier 2 identification. And while you may refer a kid and that will be taken into account, it doesn't guarantee that they're going to end up in tier 2. The other thing is we have to have valid tools for screening and validated risk verification procedures. And luckily, the National Center on Intensive Intervention hosts the screening tools chart, and I'll walk through an example. So if you want to look at your tool, just tell me what tool you have in the chat box. But some tools are better at identifying risk than others. And so if we have a tool that's not that great, we want to be honest about our current reality. And the less valid and reliable our tool is, the more dependent we become on alternative sources of data to confirm that risk. So it takes more time, right? So the way that we think about risk identification is around cut scores. And every tool that's out there that says that it identifies at-risk kids, what it does is it has a score that's put in place that separates kids as at risk or not at risk. The validity of that cut score determines how well you're going to be able to identify kids as in need of intervention. And so ideally, we would want it to be 100% accurate. And I'll show you an example. We do see this in the medical field, but we've never seen it in education. So what we end up having is we have false positives and false negatives, no matter how great our tool is. So here's an example, and it's going to get a little nerdy here. So if you need to close your eyes for a little bit, that's okay. But when we think about risk, I think sometimes we believe our screening tool cleanly separates kids into risk and not at risk. But in reality, we only really see that in maybe the medical field or some sort of field that has a very clear mathematical calculation, right? This number indicates this number indicates this. And so if you think about sickle cell anemia, you either have it or you don't have it, right? There's no sort of in between, and that's there. But when we think about education, like a reader, for example, there are benchmarks or scores that say this is a kid who's a good reader, but it's not completely sure. I mean, I had a kid with a learning disability. She read 5 grade levels below. She did very well in college, right? And then I also have kids who are grade level readers who do really poor in college, right? So it's an indicator, but there's so much gray in it that we sort of look at an arbitrary cut score that says, based on what we see, most kids who score here tend to be not at risk. And most kids at separate are at risk, right? So it's just a little more gray. And if you want to just sort of understand that, because this is where we get into screening tools, what we want as much as possible are these two red, the sensitivity and specificity. And sensitivity of a screening tool says that, and if you're in special ed and you're doing like a dyslexia screener, you're doing a diagnostic tool, these same principles apply. That it says my screening tool said the kid was at risk and they were actually at risk, right? That's what we want. We want that to be 100%. But in reality, we just don't get that level of accuracy, right? So we settle for a sufficient level, and that's often around 70 to 80%, accurately identifying kids who are at risk on the screener and really at risk. The other thing that we want to happen with our screening tool is to be able to identify accurately those kids who are not at risk, who are really not at risk, right? And sometimes those are the kids at the very high green. It's pretty clearly outlined. And so those true positives and negatives help us be more confident in identifying risk. The challenge with screening tools is that there's always false positives and there's always false negatives. And so that's why when we say, if your screening tool says these kids are yellow and these kids are green, we can't be 100% confident that all the kids in yellow are really at risk. And more likely what we're going to see is, of those kids in yellow, we've probably got about 80% of them right on. And of all those kids in green, we probably accurately identified about 80% of those kids as being at risk. So this is just another sort of illustration, but it also sort of gets at that arbitrary screening point, right, or cut score, that we can change how accurate our our true positives are and how accurate our true negatives. And so when I said earlier that most screening tools over-identify kids, that's this last one right here, meaning that we are probably more here, is that we're likely to identify kids who don't really need help in our initial screen so that we are not missing these kids, right? But we also have to be realistic. I can't get it 100% correct. If I move the cut score here and made sure I identified 100% of kids who are at risk, I'm likely to be providing intervention to a bunch of kids who don't need it. That's very expensive and is going to lead to disengagement of kids. So there are resources out there, and I think a lot of educators and administrators aren't really taught how to use these tools to really understand the limitations and the strengths of their screening tools, right? We put a lot of weight on a screening tool that says this kid needs special ed, or this kid needs tier 2, or this kid needs tier 3 intervention. And we have to be honest that the tool can help us do it, but we have to use other validation procedures to confirm that risk. And so the sensitivity and specificity, that's what I was saying, the true positives, like we really identified the kids at risk and really identified the kids at not at risk. We want those to be sufficiently high. And you'll see here, the 70 to 80% is often what we're looking at. 100% is not realistic. Now, Supriya is going to put this link in the chat box, but if you don't really like data, then I recommend not going to it and then just staying on the screen. But it's really fascinating, and I think it's something that we often overlook. We make assumptions that because we purchased this tool or this tool is available, that it can do more than it was really able to do, right? That we assume that, let's say I purchase MAP or AimsWeb or FastBridge, that if it says the kid's at risk, then they must be at risk. And I just want to give you a little bit of behind the scenes to understand how a tool, for example, can have a full bubble and look like it's a great screening tool, but not really give you the accuracy of screening that you may be thinking you're getting. So we look at our screening data, and if you want me to look at your particular tool, just put it in the chat box and I'll walk through it. But this is the MAP tool. It's just an example, but it's K2. And I want to point that out because what you're going to see in the data is very common among K2 screening tools. And it has a lot of implications for how we identify kids for intervention in the early grades. So if you look here, that sensitivity and specificity, that's what we just talked about. What we want is a tool, right, that is identifying a kid at risk who is really at risk. And I don't know if you remember, we're looking at around 70 to 80%. From a ratio standpoint, what you see here is this is about 50% or 63% in first grade. So it's lower, right? And the true positive means I have a lot of false negatives, right? So if I'm only getting 50% accuracy in who's at risk, that means I'm missing about 50% of the kids who are actually at risk, right? And so same thing here is I'm feeling more confident with my true negatives, right? It's a much higher level. And so I can say, wow, when I get these screening data, if it says the kid is not at risk, they're more likely to not be at risk. But if it says they are, I have to remember that there's some error in that. And that's important because K2 tools tend to over-identify, and we need to be thoughtful about saying, oh my gosh, 50% of our kindergartners were identified as at risk. And in reality, you know, we probably need to confirm risk. Most kids are over-identified because they've never been exposed to the task. They are still learning. They don't even understand what you're asking them to do. So they're just indicators. As kids get older, when we get up to 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, you will see a pretty stable level of accuracy in identifying risk in most tools. So I just share this because the cut score matters, and we need to understand why the cut score was set the way it was cut. So if your school is using a certain screener and they're setting the cut score at X, teachers need to be able to share with parents and teachers and other students why they're showing up as at risk. So here is an example. And this one here, if we put our cut score right in the middle, it means we're probably going to get, you know, a healthy accuracy of who's not at risk and a healthy accuracy to who's at risk, but then there's some error. But I can actually change that and increase the number of kids I identify as not at risk, which means all of these kids on the right side of that cut score were actually at risk, but I didn't identify them. Or I can go the other way and say, look, I don't want to miss any kids. So I'm going to make sure that I pick a cut score that accurately identifies most of the kids at risk by increasing the error in identifying who's actually not at risk. This sort of strategy what happens is I just need to do more risk identification procedures. And this matters, that difference, because what we sometimes see is that districts will allow schools to set their own cut scores, and that can create a lot of inequity for students who need supplemental supports. So if we get data like this that shows school 1 has 50% of kids at or above cut score, school 2 has 60%, school 3 has 48%. Just give me a number. Which school do you think is performing best, right? Which has the best program based on this risk identification? And just put your 1, 2, or 3 in the chat box. Don't all do it at once. So if we look at this, what we see is this school 2, right, has the most kids who are at or above target. Now, if I told you, well, the school districts just made up their own cut scores, where that school 2 had a lower cut score than school 1. And so while school 1 looks like it only had 50% of kids at or above target, it technically is performing significantly better. So what we promote at the national level is consistency in your cut score, that you're using national norms, you're using a district norm, so that when we think about equitable access to tier 2, what we see is, in this case, school 3 has most of its kids at risk and that's that pitfall 1, you've got to address that. Where school 1, maybe still has a lot of kids in there, but it can more realistically provide that tier 2 than, let's say, school 2 or school 3. So I didn't get any responses, and I hope you all are still there. So if you can just give me a thumbs up or a, yeah, that made sense, or if, I don't know if you can do a wide-eyed emoji that says OMG. But I think a lot of you are in the special education world where you maybe weren't involved in the decision about screening. And that's unfortunate, because a lot of that screening data may actually be the data that's leading to the referral to special education and is guiding like your goal setting for those students. All right, so when we think about the development of that risk identification, like I said, we need that initial tool, that initial primary resource of risk status. It is really where we should invest our resources to make sure that we got the best tool for our setting. Now, the risk identification process should not be done by an individual, so there should be a team. If you have your PLCs, or maybe you have an MTSS team, that's where that teaming decision would be made. That team also sort of oversees what's the definition of risk, right? That you're at the cut score, at or below the cut score, and these things happen. That's risk in our school. And something I just want to point out, I mentioned, the risk status is a little trickier in K1-2, but we kind of have this weird issue on the other extreme, which is in the high school, is that we can really predict risk status for high school by even looking at 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, right? So just know that it doesn't necessarily need to be a purchased tool. If you're a 9th grader, I can actually look back at your 8th grade test scores for the state, and that's a good indicator of risk. I can look at your credits. That's a good indicator of risk. I don't need to purchase another tool that is doing a literacy assessment. So in the other portions of that handout, you'll start to see that there's some guidance, and that's there to help you think, about who's going to be on that team. I mean, if you're doing risk verification, it typically occurs at least twice a year. So once at the beginning of the year with your fall screening, and once again with your winter screening. You don't really have to do it with your spring screening, because technically, you're not identifying kids as at risk unless you're going to do summer school or something like that. You're really using that third screening for program evaluation, because as kids start the next school year, they'll do screening again. So at a minimum, at least 2 times a year. When we think about the definition, we want to make sure that there is consensus among the staff around what is a definition of at risk. It helps us prevent any sort of challenges that we have and why so-and-so didn't get an intervention and another kid did. But what I would be careful about is making claims like kids who are in title and special education don't fall under that risk status. I mean, reality, those are kids who fall under that risk status as well. Like that may actually increase their risk, but it doesn't guarantee their access to a certain service unless it's in their IEP or some other plan that you have. And then I think, you know, having this honest conversation about what is our primary data source for risk. I've been in schools where half of the teachers trust one source of data, their FNP data, and another set of teachers in the same school trust the FastBridge data. And then you have another set of teachers who don't trust any data, they just believe of what they see. And so there has to be general consensus about what is that primary resource. And the tools chart that I shared can really help build that confidence that they're selecting the right primary source. And so a good question you might ask is, what is your target outcome? And what is the primary data source we'll use for risk identification? At secondary, it's often 3 measures is an individual risk identification, where in the elementary, we tend to look at a single measure, either a literacy measure or a math academic measure. And then once we've got that primary data source and we feel confident that that's a primary data source, then we can think about secondary and additional sources. The challenge that teams often have is people have views about which is a better source. I like my FNP data. I saw the kid doing that. Those were still valid sources, but they're not the primary. So if you have a screening that shows the kids at risk and your 2 secondary don't show risk, then you can justify that, right? But if you have at least, you know, another data source confirming risk, then you've got to trust that is an indicator of risk status. So in the handout, what you'll see is there are some guidelines to be thinking about as you write down your risk verification of risk status procedures. And as I mentioned, they've got to be in writing, because if they're not in writing, we can't confirm fidelity to implementation. And in that tool, you'll also see is this sort of very visual process. And I highly recommend in a teaming meeting where you've got, and I think a lot of people have had data walls and they put them up there, but it makes it very visible when you have all the kids who are potentially at risk and identified as at risk on the primary screener, and then justifying that risk status by additional data sources. So the primary risk status, I think the way that we can think about it is a lot of published tools already exist. As I mentioned, as you get into upper grades, you can look at things like attendance, your early warning system, your state assessments, but early grades really should be looking at predictors of academic performance, such as you know, our reading CBM or math CBM, and those are the things you would probably be doing progress monitoring for in your special education as well. Some secondary screeners that are highly recommended at the K2 level is progress monitoring. And that's because you need something that's pretty sensitive to growth. Because the tools tend to over-identify, the recommendation at K2 is you screen, you identify risk, you monitor progress before you provide intervention to confirm risk, and then provide intervention. Too often we put kids in kindergarten directly in intervention and they miss out on really core programming that they need to be able to benefit from intervention. But there's other assessments, your grades, your core assessments, and your classroom, you know, assessments, common classroom assessments that you might have. So this is an example of what I'll just provide a quick illustration, is the school conducted the screening with Fidelity, and this is the graph that they got. And as I mentioned, we don't want to just say all kids in yellow go to tier 2, all kids in red go to tier 3. It's really ineffective. So instead, what we do is we identify those kids potentially at risk. You'll see like this kid is 1 point away. They could be in the green by luck, and we want to confirm that. So what we do is we look at the initial screener risk status, and then we have a secondary screener for risk status. And then what happens, some of those kids will automatically say, yep, we confirmed risk. Yep, we confirmed that the kid has no risk or has limited risk. And then you'll see that there are a few kids who got mixed results. If you're seeing a lot of mixed results, that means one of your tools is not appropriate, and you really need to look at that. But in this case, we use some additional data source, whether it's problem solving, something that's really accessible, diagnostic data, and confirm that risk status. So in this case, you'll see the additional data source confirmed risk. Those kids would be confirmed as needing intervention, right? So it's just a very systematic process. It's meant to improve the equitability of being able to be identified as at risk and accessing tier 2 intervention, so that it's not an arbitrary decision making. That arbitrary decision making about who gets it and who doesn't really opens your school up for some kids not accessing the supports they need, including kids with disabilities. So this is the last activity, and just knowing that you're super quiet, we'll definitely finish up a little early. But I did want to give you an opportunity, just a couple of minutes like we did last time, to take a look at the remaining steps. So that third step is identifying and verifying risk status. Do you have a primary screener? Do you have supplemental data that's valid and reliable to confirm that risk? And then really thinking about, once we have that, then can we select the number of kids, right? Because we'll have this kids identified as in need of intervention, and can compare that to our capacity to start to place kids where they need to be. It's our closest thing to accurate identification that we can get at this point in time. So I'm going to give you just 3 minutes, and then we'll come back and reflect and think about continuous improvement. But I'm hoping at least 3 of you can share out just some of your thoughts about either what you're using for your primary screener, and if you have some secondary sources, what are those? So we'll just take 3 minutes, and then we'll come back. I don't see any questions. And I just want to point out that Supriya put in the chat box, there's a resource around what is classification accuracy, as well as early warning systems. So if you're in a secondary setting, middle school or high school, you may be saying, gosh, I don't really know what our primary source is. Early warning systems are a good way to help structure that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Ellen. Yeah, a lot of schools are using FastBridge. I would say there was a period of time where lots of schools were using FastBridge. And I think it would be a good question for those schools is to say, how do you verify that risk? I do know in FastBridge, they've tried to build in some risk verification, like additional data sources that you could do within a system, right? So you're selling a package. So hopefully they're doing something like that, but that would be a good question to find out. Yeah, so there's a question around recommendations for diagnostic tools. I will share, and I don't know, Supriya, if you can get this from the National Center on Intensive Intervention, there is a not a tools chart, but a table of free diagnostic tools. But that's some easy recommendations, Tracy. I think it kind of depends on what you're looking for. Is it like secondary math or early literacy or even behavior? There are an array of tools there, but the FAST does have some diagnostic capacity, and that comes back to what Ellen was just saying, is that they tried to create a comprehensive assessment system so you could have your primary data source, maybe your RCBM or your adaptive measure, and then use those additional tools within there for more diagnostic purposes. Yeah, and tools like MAP and STAR, like that are more adaptive measures, try to balance out the screening properties of identifying risk while also providing a diagnostic component to it. That's why they're more expensive, but it's also why they take a lot longer to administer than, say, like a FastBridge CBM type measure. Yeah, so Supriya put in there some examples of diagnostic tools, and these are helpful. You know, we don't always recommend a diagnostic tool for all kids. So I think there was a point where everybody was giving a diagnostic tool for every kid. But if we think about core standards and core curriculum, there are just things that all kids need to know. And we really need to be focused on differentiating within there realistically. The use of diagnostic tools are helpful in Tier 2 when students are not responding. So that initial screening can say what's the area of concern. Your supplemental measures, your secondary measures and tertiary measures can give us the nature of that risk, right? Like maybe they're struggling in reading, but it's because they don't come to school. And so you can use that secondary source as a way to understand the nature of the risk. So I'm going to read this. So one of the issues, and just let me know if I can use your name, that this person is running into is that there's a belief that if a student has a disability, then they're entitled to special services and should not be tying up non-special services. And that's so true. And we, OSEP tried to make that very clear in some guidance that came out in 2011, that just because you have a disability and have been found eligible under IDEA, that does not prevent you from accessing the services within MTSS. So it's likely who's providing that service may be a special ed teacher, but like I was mentioning, you could just have speech and language, right, is your area of concern, and so you're getting special ed there. You should still be able to access Tier 2, Tier 3 intervention in literacy and math, right? Because those are not services that are being provided under special education. Now, if they need it because of their disability, then it should be there, but it's not as clear cut as we think. And so you're saying that many times a student will have a lower level need that doesn't relate to their disability exactly. And I think that's this conversation. I think you were mentioning it earlier, Ellen, is that there's a misunderstanding. And I think, Dina, you said that they go from Tier 1 to Tier 3. They don't even understand that there's this middle ground of supplemental supports that are part of the general education system available to all kids. So any ideas about printed resources to help correct that misconception? So on the center, and I can give you a graphic that actually was based on some work from OSEP in collaboration with Title Services around how kids fit, even if they're identified as gifted and talented or special education, should be able to access services across the tiers of support based on their needs, not necessarily their disability label or the program label they're being served under. So if I can't find that, Supriya, I think it's on the RTI Center's website under special education, special topics. You'll find that there. If not, I will share a graphic that really illustrates that, Ellen, that you might be able to use with your sites. Okay. So I I appreciate the conversation, and I think, Ellen, as you alluded to, this is not something that special ed can address, and it's also not something that just general ed can address. It does require this collaboration across all programs, right? And as I mentioned, gifted services, counseling, because those are also areas in which we provide tier 2. And something else to think about is, while I think some of you in special ed probably see this as like, oh my gosh, the kids in tier 3, they're supposed to be special ed. That's not necessarily the case. And so it's important to remember, just because our initial or primary screening tool identifies the kid as at risk, doesn't mean that the tier 2 intervention is what's needed. Or it doesn't even mean that the tier 2 intervention in that domain is needed. And I sort of shared an example where the kid could show up as at risk in literacy, right? You did a reading screener, but really the reason the kid is struggling in reading, it's a social emotional issue, right? Or an attendance issue. So it's not a one-to-one correspondence. All this process is doing is identifying risk, that primary source, and then our secondary sources can verify the nature of that risk to better match them to what the services they need. And I'll find that graphic too before we leave, and then just to show it on the screen too, Ellen, because I shared it in the tier 1. It is in that session, so I'll pull those slides. I think the other thing is just really being honest about what do we do when our capacity is less than the identified students. Even if I've verified that these kids need intervention, I still have to be looking at my capacity, because if I don't, then I'm going to make assumptions that my watered down tier 2 is going to support kids, which then will lead to the over-identification of kids moving to tier 3, or in some cases, special ed. And we don't want that to happen. The purpose of tier 2 is to meet the underlying needs of students so they can benefit from core programming. Some ways to get around that, or just to think about where do we go, is just making sure that if you do get a bunch of kids who are confirmed as at risk and in need of intervention, but you can only provide intervention for half of them, what it means is you're providing a really robust tier 1, like the PALS program that we talked about, or the tier 1 supplement that would allow you to address their needs. It's not like you're not doing anything, but you should still be progress monitoring those kids. And that's where sometimes you'll see like iReady or ISIP or STAR Literacy that have the monthly progress monitoring. That's a way to monitor those tier 2 kids who may not be getting very intensive intervention. And that would be appropriate. And so I would just say too, if your capacity is being overwhelmed, you've got to stop, step back, and refocus on your tier 1, or you're not going to be able to sustain. And just as we close up, there are some considerations. These are in the handout. And so, as you're meeting with your teams or you're trying to figure out what happens next, these are just some questions to think about, right? Like, does the data suggest that the process we're using is effective? We do a lot of things and assume that it's going to work, right? And no one really systematically checks. Are we over-identifying or are we under-identifying? Are we overloading our capacity? Has our capacity changed? That's essential for maintaining a validated approach to identification. Does our progress monitoring data suggest that some students, maybe who are identified as at risk are not at risk, right? Or maybe our data showed the kid wasn't at risk and now they are at risk, which is why we screen at least fall and winter to catch those kids. So it's just really thinking about, once we have a system in place, don't just say, oh, we're done, but make sure that we're doing some of that ongoing evaluation of that to make sure it's appropriate. So I want to just stop right there. You probably don't have a lot of questions because you've been super quiet. But if you have any additional questions or comments just about this idea of tier 2. And in the next session, we'll talk about tier 3 and get more into the the nuts and bolts of that. But if we don't get the right kids, then it's really hard to understand what those kids need so we can design the interventions necessary for those kids. And I'll just see, Tom or Dina, or any of you also have questions that maybe you get from your sites that you want to share.
No, I was just going to throw out there, and this is actually more of a tier 3 situation, but looking at interventions or programs specifically for tier 2 and tier 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that goes back to what Dina was saying, where we have there really is absence of a tier 2, and you go straight from tier 1 to tier 3, and some belief that, you know, that there should be a specific package or program designed for each tier. But
yeah. And I think, that's a really critical question, is what happens once you identify them. There was a very large scale IES study, had about 10,000 sites. And the findings of the study were, if you were identified as at risk, you actually had worse outcomes. And people were like, well, that's horrible. Well, let's just not identify them at risk. But really what they were finding is that people were doing a fairly decent job of saying these kids were at risk, but did not have an appropriate response for once they got at risk. Or, like I said, they overwhelmed the tier 2 system. Like, they identified all the kids, but they didn't have the capacity to support them. And so they just gave a little bit to a lot of kids at no measurable effect. All right, well, I want to just close up here, and I will stay on and try to find that graphic for you as well. But I just want to give you an opportunity to reflect. I'm hoping at least 3 people can share in the chat box. But really, what's the number? So this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the step that you feel needs to have a little more focus, maybe in your site, or an area where you think, this is something that we could refine or improve. We're doing a good job, but we want to make sure that we're a little more thoughtful about it. So just give me a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in the chat box. 1, yeah, the assessing, lots of 1s. Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. A couple of 3s in there. Yeah, because some of us don't have a lot of kids, right, that are in our system. And so we feel pretty comfortable with those kids. But I think COVID, that assessing is trying to think about the now and maybe thinking about in the future as kids come back or needs change, if you're going to see any differences. I also saw a 5 in there. Well, I want to pass this back over to our WDE colleagues, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and look for that thing. And if I find it, I will repost it. But I do also want to remind folks that it's also in the Tier 1 training materials.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Bailey, for your time and sharing your expertise with us today.